Well, when Deborah asked me to do this, actually it was Jim who suggested to Deborah that she asked me to do this. She wanted to know what the title would be, and I said, how about There's a Woman in the Locker Room? And hold on a minute. Jim, where's... So why the title? Well, because I was among the female pioneers in sports writing back in the mid-1970s, when women were fighting to be accepted as sports journalists, not female sports journalists. When women were breaking barriers inside their media organizations and outside with teams, players, coaches, managers, and the front office. History. When Major League Baseball Commissioner Bowie Kuhn prohibited Sports Illustrated's Melissa Ludke from interviewing players in the clubhouse during the 1977 World Series, SI's publisher, Time Incorporated, filed a lawsuit. The following year, in 1978, a U.S. federal court judge ruled male and female reporters should have equal access to the locker room. Back in those days, and for a decade plus after, when I or a female colleague of mine stepped into the locker room, you'd hear the shout. Now, it went different ways. If it was the clubhouse manager standing at the door, it would be, there's a woman in the locker room. Or if it was a player or players in various stages of undress, it would be, there's a woman in the locker room. Being a woman in such a male-oriented field has always been a topic of conversation. Specifically, what's it like being in the locker room with a bunch of naked men? I'm going to answer this for you. This is all you need to know. All you need to know about locker room coverage. I grew up in Neenah, Wisconsin, population 22,000, 40 miles south of Green Bay. So I always have believed that I was destined to cover pro football. My father was a Packers season ticket holder beginning in the late 1950s, and I watched football with him on television. My mother tells the story that when I was 4 years old, she remembers looking out the kitchen window, seeing me with a football helmet on, and madly biking down the street on my tricycle to play football with the boys. I was pre-Title IX, which gave equal opportunity to boys and girls. So sports weren't really emphasized when I was growing up, academics were. When I was in 8th grade, I was watching pro football with my dad. We were watching CBS and the NFL Today with Brent Musburger, Irv Cross, and Phyllis George. And my dad said, "You ought to be a sportscaster like Phyllis George." And I thought, well, that would be a really cool job. And then I found out that she was a Miss America winner. And I just couldn't see myself as a beauty pageant contestant. But that was the only role model I had back then. So I focused on becoming a concert violinist, and I kept my sports as a huge passion. Everything changed when I was a freshman at Stanford. Some of the guys in the dorm dared me to do a noon sports show on KZSU Radio, the campus radio station. I found out later that they all gathered around the radio waiting for me to make a mistake, and I didn't. It all felt so natural and so comfortable. That summer, I volunteered at a TV station in Green Bay in sports. Sophomore year at Stanford, I began writing for the Stanford Daily. And then another change. I was a music major until I failed a classics final. Of course, I'd had the flu that weekend, and I'd thrown up at the GA's house during a study group, so I should have known that whatever studying I did was not going to get me anywhere on the final. And across the top of this final, he wrote, "It's obvious you don't know how to write." So I got on my bike and I crossed campus and I declared myself a communication major, journalism emphasis, that very same day. My junior year, I became the first female sports editor of the Stanford Daily. And as an overachiever, the overachiever that I am, I also started writing for the San Francisco Chronicle, Associated Press, Stanford Observer. I had a summer internship at the Milwaukee Journal. I took theory and technique of football from Bill Walsh. I took theory and technique of basketball, theory and technique of tennis. I started taking PE courses, kinesiology courses, anatomy courses, because I felt that I needed to know how to play the games, how the games were coached, the strategy behind them, the movement of the bodies, the muscles, because I knew that I was going to be challenged in ways that men weren't. Men would walk in and start asking questions of athletes, and athletes would automatically think they know what they're talking about because they're a guy. My senior year, I applied everywhere. I must have applied to 60 different newspapers back when there were that many newspapers. And the response was, well, we already have one woman, so we really don't need two. I ended up graduating 3 months early, went back and worked at the Milwaukee morning paper, the Milwaukee Sentinel. And on my first day of work, one of the guys took me aside and said, okay, here's the deal. You work 3 to midnight or 4 to 1. You don't work before work, you don't work on your days off. I thought, how does anybody get anywhere here? That turned out to be a smart bit of advice, because all I did then was work. 2 months into the job, the sports editor was assigning beats, and I was hoping that I would be able to cover something major. But no, he announced in the Milwaukee Brewers press box during a baseball game, Jill can't have a beat because she can't get into the locker room. So I was put in charge of a page that came out every Friday called Your Sports. It was a participatory sports page. You wrote about amateur athletes around town, you wrote about mommy and baby exercise classes, that sort of thing. But I kept plugging along and tried to write features about big-name athletes who would come into town to play the Milwaukee teams, or write sidebars at games, so I'd be the secondary or third story. And finally, when they dropped a column it was a syndicated column by a woman named Joan Ryan at the Washington Post, they decided that they wanted to replace that with a column written by me. And I'll never forget sitting crafting my first column, and I turned to one of the best writers on the staff, a man, and I asked a grammatical question, and he just looked at me and said, the only reason you're getting this column is because you're a girl. I was fully aware of the fact that I was probably 6 months out of college, and here I had a column, and there weren't a lot of female columnists then. So I realized that I probably wasn't ready for it, but I also knew that when doors open, even if you're not ready, you've got to walk through them, because they might not open again. The next 3.5 years turned out to be extremely rewarding. Obviously, I was way over motivated than a lot of the people on the staff who were only working 3 to midnight and 4 to 1 and never on their days off. But there were also many other things that happened. I was taunted in clubhouses. The first time the Milwaukee Brewers clubhouse was opened because of me. It wasn't my paper that backed me, it was actually the Milwaukee Journal that backed me. And I'll never forget walking into that clubhouse and realizing, oh, I don't know where anybody's locker is. So you're walking in there and you're scanning the place, so it looks like you're looking at... And one of the guys, a pitcher, Larry Sorensen, said to me, what is wrong with you? You're like a shade of green. And then the guy I needed to interview was named Jim Gantner, and he was totally naked, and he was in the back of the room, and he said, well, she wanted to come in here. You just tell her to come over here now and talk to me. And I said, just have the guy put a towel on. What's the big deal? There was also a point where I was sexually assaulted by a player in one of my interviews. I think because I tend to do really in-depth human personality profiles and get people to talk about a lot of really deep stuff, he must have taken it a little bit further. That was at a time, though, that this is like pre-Anita Hill and women complaining about sexual assault and sexual harassment. So here I was wondering, how am I going to go back to my sports editor and tell him, this guy jumped me and I almost couldn't get him off me and he was ripping at my pants, blah, blah, blah. When this guy said, well, Jill can't have a beat, she can't get in the locker room. So I kept it really quiet, even though I still had to go out and see the guy and cover the team. And I finally told him about a month into it, and his comment was, what does he think we're running here? And he did complain, and he did tell Bud Selig, then the owner of the team. Nothing ever happened, and it didn't impact my career, which I was very worried that it might, because back in that day, when women complained about that kind of stuff, the treatment from players, which, by the way, continued to happen up until the 1990s, it was a stigma that just stuck with them. Every time they were introduced, or, oh, you know that person, remember she accused a player of that, or a player did this to her. After 3.5 years at the Sentinel, I sent my resume to Sports Illustrated, and when my dad sent me off to New York for the interview, he said, now think about the job, don't take it right away, really think if you want to move to New York. And all I can remember is standing in Rockefeller Center, looking out over the big buildings and calling him immediately and saying, I took the job. I started at $18,000 a year. That was back when I thought if you made $50,000 a year, you'd be a millionaire in New York. What did I know? And I started as a reporter where I was just basically fact-checking all the stories. And there was no promise that I would ever become a writer. In fact, Sports Illustrated really had the reputation of not being a very friendly place to women. Women hadn't made it there, and their biggest contribution to women in sports was the swimsuit issue.